Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the Nile. We meet the Nile at the beginning of the book of Shmot when it comes to the place where the baby boys are going to get thrown. It's a place of trauma, to be quite honest. But as we know, the Nile really symbolizes something much greater than just the destination for Paro's evil decrees. So why don't we jump into that?
Yeah, well, the Nile is Egypt.
Jump into the Nile.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
The Nile is Egypt. It's a symbol of Egypt. It's a symbol of Egypt's prosperity. It's a symbol of, why Egypt it becomes this great civilization. I mean, it's not just the symbol of that. It is that. And, most of Egypt, even until today, really lives in close proximity to the Nile. That's really the only part of Egypt that is fertile and sustainable. And the Nile appears all over Tanakh because it is this symbol of Egypt. I mean, starting in our story, in the story of the plagues, the first 2 plagues are about the Nile. We mentioned before the Nile turns to blood, and that's, of course, a direct result of having thrown the boys into the Nile. But it also is a symbol of what God is planning to do to Egypt, to take Egypt's life source and turn it into a symbol of death. Mm-hmm. I mean, which I think is maybe even more significant in the second plague, which has this, the Nile spew forth these, hordes of putrid frogs. And I think that's a symbol as to what it is that Egypt has released upon the world. It's released upon the world this kind of rotten culture, something which is filled with injustice, something which is not pleasant in the world.
But what's interesting about the frogs is that they're not destructive. There are plagues that are destructive, but the frogs are intrusive, they're annoying, they're gross, as you said, right? Which is interesting that in the first we have more of like a death symbol, whereas the second one, it's sort of, this has been a highly unpleasant experience. It's been unpleasant for the Jews. And you've made the world an unpleasant place. There's something that's I always find a little bit funny about the frogs.
Well, that's only if you accept that they're frogs, as in modern Hebrew.
Yes.
Rabbeinu Hananel says that they're crocodiles, and that coheres with the Mizmor and Tehillim, which talks about the Tzfardea coming with Tashchitam.
That makes it a lot more destructive.
And they're destroying, right? And then they are more destructive. So you could go in either way. Again, one of our disadvantages in knowing modern Hebrew is that we take a lot of the words from the Tanakh that we actually don't know how to identify them with certainty, and we feel quite certain about their translations. So either way, it's either that the Egypt releases destructive forces on the world, or that Egypt releases something which is
corruptive. It's corruptive,
impurifying, or a corruptive force, upon the world.
And so then we meet the Nile again later on, meaning it's a symbol in Egypt, and it becomes a symbol throughout the process of the plagues. But we also meet it later on in Tanakh, where we look at the Nile as something, whether it's descriptive of the power of Egypt, even when this power has already waned. And we also meet it in Sefer Dvarim, in Perek Yud Aleph, right? There we have a description of the difference between life in Egypt versus life in Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Dvarim Perek Yud Aleph, it's almost, I almost find it sometimes a little bit amusing, right? Because Moshe is speaking to the people on the eve of entrance into the land, and he says to the people, the land which you're about to come to, Loch Eretz Mitzrayim asher yitzatem misham, right? It's not like Egypt. The land that you're coming to, don't expect Egypt. And then the difference between the description of Egypt and the land of Israel relates to how they irrigate their fiams, right?
I'll just stop you for one second in the middle of that sentence, which is something that always strikes me here is that, well, we remember in the book of Shmot where Am Yisrael fantasized about what was in Egypt. But what's always interesting or just powerful for me when I read these sukkim is that clearly God assumes that our model of a society where things function more easily is still Egypt, because we haven't met another model yet. We haven't created it. We're the ones who are going to have to create it. And so Egypt is still our model of the place that has water, of the place that functions, that's lush, that that enables our life to really flourish. And so God uses that and says, I know this is still your frame of reference, so I'm going to use it now in contrast to what you're about to go into, which is going to be a lot less simple than what they had in Egypt.
Yeah. I mean, I think, when you talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim in general, there's a certain kind of tension between you go down to Egypt, you experience and you meet a very successful thriving, prosperous society. On the other hand, you have to turn your back on Egypt and not look back at Egypt. That's the place where, lo tosifun lashuv el haderech hazeh, right? Don't go back to that path. That path is a corrupt path. And actually, Am Yisrael in the Midbar, when they're longing for Egypt over and over and over, they're turning back and looking for Egypt. They're making a big mistake. I like to call it the Mrs. Lot mistake, right? Because, of course, when she leaves Stone,
turns around.
She's told, don't look back, right? And then she looks back and she becomes part of the destruction. I would even suggest that that's why Am Yisrael, that first generation, has to die out in the desert.
Yeah.
Because they're a little too attached to Egypt. So it's true. I agree with you completely that Egypt is their best frame of reference for how to create a successful society. But it also is about what not to do.
Oh, it's a negative reference.
That. Yeah.
It's a totally negative reference.
Yeah.
So what is Eretz Yisrael going to be as opposed to Mitzrayim?
So I think that it's a really basic difference. And that is that the land of Egypt, you plant your seeds, right? Tizra zaracha, v'hishkita v'raglacha kagan hayarak, and then you irrigate with your feet. Whatever it means to irrigate with your feet, you're pressing on some kind of lever that is releasing the water from the Nile into those canals, and that leads it into your field. Whatever it means to irrigate with your feet, it's clearly a contrast to the land of Israel, which is an Eretz Harim Uvekaot. Even if you had a river in the land of Israel, which we don't, right? The Jordan is never called a river, and even the maximal borders of Israel are
up until
Nahar Mitzrayim ad Nahar Gadol Nahar Prat, right? Up to, but not including the two great rivers, right? So the land of Israel cannot theologically contain a river, even if it could. It's a land of mountains and valleys. But the most important point that I think that Moshe makes in these psukim is limtar hashamayim tishteh mayim. You get your water from the heavens. And therefore, right, well, the psukim, I would sort of think, therefore, you are always looking to the heavens. But the psukim go on and say, therefore, it's Eretz Asher Hashem Elokecha Doresh Ota. Tamid Einei Hashem Elokecha Ba Mereshit HaShana Ve'ad Acharit Shana, right? So God's eyes are looking at the land. But of course, by the same token, our eyes are looking upward. And I think that this really cuts to the heart of the difference between what kind of society we're trying to create in Israel as opposed to in Egypt. In Egypt, what winds up happening in this kind of society where the Nile is the source of your prosperity and success is that you look downward and you begin to see your legs, your hands, right?
Yourself.
You see yourself. Ma'aseh yadeinu, ma'aseh ragleinu. You see kochi ve'otzem yadi. Yechezkel has this, I think, really remarkable image of the Paro who is swimming in his Yeor, and he is saying as he swims, Li Yeori va'ani asitini. That's my Nile. I made it. It leads to the deification of humans and the deification of human success, right? You know, it's our success that brought about all this prosperity, as opposed to in the land of Israel, looking upwards and recognizing that economic prosperity and all success comes from God.
I mean, I think it also sets up one of many paradigms throughout Tanakh where there is a real hesitation when it comes to prosperity, when it comes to things coming easily, that there's something we always sort of want to maintain a slight degree of struggle, because one, it creates a dependence on God, and two, because it keeps people humble. And I think that Tanakh in many ways really wants us to make sure that our relationships reflect that kind of humility. On one side of that equation, certainly we see in the Tochacha that if we aren't able to sort of uphold that kind of relationship, then we get kicked out. But when we live in Eretz Yisrael, one of the ways that we maintain that humble relationship with God and also vis-a-vis ourselves is by the fact that we are dependent on God for one of the main avenues of sustenance that we need in this country. I think that's a very, very powerful point.
Yeah.
We want to wish everybody a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. It's been a pleasure to be here with you today, and looking forward to keep learning more Torah.
Chag Sameach.